adapted from a Reddit post and is purely fictional. This episode is a compilation of Ep.1-3. I return to the Aurora Arctic Research Station once again. The outpost. I thought I would have to slowly adjust again to the phenomena of the midnight sun and polar night that had troubled me for so long. Just felt uneasy inside. But it's work. Making money is important. The outpost I am stationed at is a climate research station. It is home to around 30 scientific and support staff year-round. Scientists from various fields, logistics personnel, management staff and so on, although most of the researchers here are geologists and climatologists, an anthropologist. There might be a slight professional disconnect. Actually, outside of work hours, we get along very well. And because I'm the only one in the entire northern Alaskan research area who speaks Inuktitut, which is the Eskimo language, they're also happy to ask me about indigenous stories, Inuktitut proverbs, and so on. We really get along well in private. This afternoon, after we finished organizing our gear, we plan to cross a snow-capped mountain to the northeast, heading into the heart of the mountain range. Before that, we must find a logistical base near the mountains for communication and equipment setup. A small Inuit village with only about 60 or 70 residents. It became the only choice. These villagers, the last time I came for research, I had already become pretty familiar with them by then. They were very enthusiastic when we chatted and ate together. But as soon as they found out we were heading toward the heart of the snow mountain, they all changed their expressions. If we told their elders, that's what their shaman Katak translated. It's the mountain we're about to cross. An extremely ancient and mysterious mountain covered in glaciers, a dangerous mountain. Their ancestors called it the nest of the dead. Isn't that cheesy? I thought the same thing back then. What era are we in, still believing in ghosts, spirits, and those kinds of folk tales? So we, the whole team, weren't too worried about it. Compared to these trivial matters, we'd rather focus on the glacial crevasses on our research expedition and the unpredictable weather. Therefore, we set off as planned. Before 5, our base was already bustling. Everyone was ready to go. Even the Eskimo dogs were all incredibly excited. 1 by 1, 2, 3, they were all barking. I was assigned to team up with a girl named Becca before we reach our destination. All we need to do is look out for each other, keep an eye on our gear and stabilize the snowmobile. Stay close to the group. It's that simple. The 2 snowmobiles set off with the sled dogs pulling them. Slowly, the terrain we were on changed from white snow to rocky slope. Finally, under the guide's direction, our team stopped at the foot of the snow mountain. That's right, our first stop for the survey was at the base of the mountain. Because of this, there is a cave that has existed for an unknown number of years, hidden beneath the ice layers. Originally, drilling into things like this had nothing to do with me. But I don't know what happened today. Watching Becca slowly drill through the frozen earth beneath her feet, and seeing the cave slowly getting closer, I seemed to get interested too, so I called out to Becca. Becca probably saw the look of expectation on my face. She pointed down and said she'd take me down there later. Thanks to her connections at the base, she had already arranged a set for me, a suit with lighting. We first stashed our luggage and then entered the cave. As soon as we entered the cave, I felt it was even colder inside than it was outside. Not just because of the low temperature, but also due to some unfathomable sense of insecurity. I comforted myself with saying, it's probably because my eyes haven't adjusted to the darkness yet. Focus, let's see. My job is to look for ancient bone fishhooks and obsidian spearheads. Just focus on finding these ruins. Don't worry about anything else, like whether you're scared. But I had just managed to calm down, not even for 10 minutes, when Becca, who was deep inside the cave, suddenly screamed. I was startled. She yelled my name and told me to come over, saying, "No, come here. There's work for you here." I did not even care about her loud voice echoing. The shock made my head hurt so much. I could only feel my heart racing. I couldn't wait to excitedly rush inside. When I slowly got a bit closer, I almost broke into a cold sweat. In the glacier crack ahead of Becca, it looked like there was a body stuck inside. I calmed myself down and asked, "Is it the body of a previous explorer?" "She can't make it clear. How about we move it out and take a look?" After some discussion, we began to use various tools, without hurting ourselves, and without damaging the body. We slowly took the remains out from the crack bit by bit. But what we dug up wasn't an Arctic explorer, but a strange nose-eating female corpse. Her body was mostly intact, with no obvious mutilations. Very complete, but from her neck to her feet, there were these blue-black, tattoo-like markings. What's even stranger is, she wore a porcelain mask with designs similar to tattoos on her face. The mask didn't cover her open mouth from when she died, and the numerous, specially sharpened teeth inside. Even though we couldn't see her whole face, I still felt. It feels like this woman is looking at me through a mask. It makes me feel extremely uncomfortable. Flashlight slowly explores downward. We discover that it's not just a corpse. In her curled up arms, there's also the body of an infant, equally dried up and stiff. Although the infant doesn't have a mask, its mouth is open, just like its mother's. After seeing the child, Becca instinctively recoiled and gasped. I was trembling and thinking, I've been to the Arctic many times. But this woman's clothing, tattoos, and mask were completely inconsistent with the Inuit culture of this region. My intuition told me this was from a much older civilization. I don't know if I'm more afraid or excited right now. It's a toss-up. I continued to shine my flashlight deeper into the crevice. What I saw next was a black knife where the two bodies had been. A black knife? But you must know that the Inuit tribe is always only the source of this metal tool, iron ore. When our lights probe further inside, an even more unbelievable sight suddenly appears before me. Deep within the cave, frozen into the cave walls, in the crevices and the ice layers, there are corpses, just like the mother and child we saw earlier. All the adults are wearing porcelain masks, covered in tattoos, bearing their teeth. Each corpse is preserved remarkably well. They seem to have formed a mural together inside this cave. Becca walked up and asked me, did they encounter something before they died? I casually speculated. It's too early to draw conclusions now. Anything is possible, like dying from illness or starvation, or encountering a blizzard or something. I haven't finished talking. Becca's walkie-talkie suddenly exploded with static. Then we heard Old Han, who was in charge of directing from above, say, everyone is still below ground. Evacuate the cave immediately. Our drill bit accidentally punctured a natural gas deposit, which is releasing an unknown toxic gas. Everyone evacuate immediately. After we heard this, we didn't bother to study these remains. Without looking back, we ran towards the exit. What Lahan said was right. We had just burst from the cave, when a full-smelling gas like rotten eggs poured in from all directions, slowly engulfing the entire base of the mountain. Looking through the gas, the sky and sun were a murky, polluted color. We dodged the wildly barking snow machines and ran to the drilling site. The team members there were in complete chaos. Some were running around wildly. Others, paralyzed by fear, were huddled on the ground, convulsing. After pushing my way through the crowd, I recognized a geologist I'd become quite friendly with at the base, Erica, but her skin had turned gray-blue. She was clutching her stomach and vomiting blood onto the ground. Fortunately, at that moment, Team Dr. Lucas and other rescue personnel quickly arrived. They lifted Erica onto a stretcher and rushed her to emergency care. The other members then began the work of evacuating personnel and sealing the drilling site. Watching Erica being carried away, I thought I could finally breathe a sigh of relief, but Lucas came over and said, "Stop looking around. We need to get back to base immediately. Rika's critically ill. In fact, I suspect we all inhaled that gas." After about 16 hours of repair work, we still haven't successfully sealed the borehole. Those known gases continued to seep to the surface, carried by the wind in different directions. Sinihai, we set up a temporary camp in a sheltered spot to serve as a refuge, crowding around a portable heater. We discussed our next strategy. Erika, the worst affected by the poisoning, is now lying beside me. Her breathing is extremely weak. As Dr. Lucas said, if we continue to be exposed to the contaminated air, soon we will all become like this. That's why Captain Hen firmly believes we must all return to the base now. But in my opinion, the road is too long. Moreover, we will inevitably pass through areas with severely polluted air. So I made a suggestion. We can go back, the small village I scouted earlier. I will take a detour while it's still unspoiled. They definitely need our reminder, and we certainly need their help. Olden asked me how long it takes to get there from this temporary camp. I said not far, 12 miles. If the whole team leaves together, it'll be too slow. I can go on my own. Oldham was shocked when he heard this. You were going alone? Do you think you're just taking a stroll back home? At this moment, Becca, who had been silent all this time, suddenly spoke up. No, I'll go with you. Shall we look out for each other? After some hesitation, I agreed to Rebecca. The distance isn't far. I can probably finish it in one day. but I do need someone to team up with me. So we immediately began assembling the supplies and snow machines for 2 people. Using heavier snow goggles and wet headscarves, we has to make 2 gas masks. We also tried to cover the snow dogs' mouths and noses with masks as much as possible, to prevent both humans and dogs from getting poisoned. Under the watchful eyes of our teammates, we set off. Once again, we returned to the strange atmosphere shrouded in toxic gas. The snow on the ground was all a matte color. The sun in the sky was also a filthy wax yellow. Even encounters with animals were unusual. For example, an Arctic hare, as dazed as a blue and white one, an Arctic fox standing on a rock. We cycled along in this strange environment. And finally, just after midnight, we reached the village. However, from a distance, I could see that the whole village was unusually quiet. There wasn't a single person outside. Not a wisp of smoke rose from any chimney. We got off the snowmobile and walked towards the village. We called out the villagers' names in Inuktitut, but there was no answer. The scattered firewood and fishing gear made us feel very uneasy. We entered the largest house. This was the house of the chief and his family. All the doors, inside and out, were unlocked. There was even untouched food on the table. But that food already had a smell similar to the poisonous gas at the drilling site. Similar smell. Becca asked if they might have already evacuated. I couldn't say for sure. Maybe. Then I checked their soup again. The whole pot of soup was still hot. That is to say, these people may have just left. But out of caution, we still checked each house, one by one. Finally, we opened the home of Elder Kadak. Katak has always lived alone on the north side of the village. His house is not big, but inside there were various tools for shamanic rituals. The types and positions of the tools are exactly the same as when I visited him before. The difference is that on the previously empty round table, there is now a black knife. Yes. It's very similar to the one I saw in the cave. And just next to the knife, on the wooden board, there is a carved line of their ethnic script. Becca also noticed the line of characters. She asked me what it meant. I translated and said. Then it stopped. Becca then asked me what Ijilak was. I thought for a moment. I wasn't sure how much I should reveal, so I gave a brief introduction. Is a monster from Inuit folklore, a creature of legend. They're said to be able to shapeshift. My grandmother used to scare me with them. She'd say if I didn't behave, the Ijirak would come and take me away while I slept. You could think of them as the Arctic's version of the big bad wolf. Becca seemed even more confused after hearing this and said, but that's just a folk tale, right? I say it depends on how you define a folk tale. Some people think it's a fairy tale, but for the priests of Katak, these gods' priests, they firmly believe it's true. I recounted in detail the legends Kadak told me, going over them thoroughly. I talked for quite a while. I just realized the air around us has gotten unbearably cold. The wind outside is also picking up. Becca reminded me that we need to find shelter. A big snowstorm is probably on its way. So we immediately set off to look for a refuge. In my mind, we needed to find something that could withstand the storm, but the terrain can't be too low to avoid the toxic gas. So, a public building on top of the central hill in the village became our first choice. The Eskimo dogs, and settled all our equipment in the house. We tried to use materials from the various rooms to seal the doors and windows to withstand the coming blizzard. While I was busy comforting the snow dogs, Becca also used the radio to contact Aurora Base. Dr. Anderson and I are trapped by the blizzard in the village west of the base. Lauhan and the others are still at the foot of the mountain. We'll act after the blizzard ends. I can receive the base's signal. I feel much more relieved. I only heard them reply, understood. Stay safe. We will maintain radio contact. Over. We've been trapped in the village by the blizzard for a day. I've rationed the food with Becca. We have canned stew, hardtack, protein bars, and so on. I drank boiled snowmelt water. The sled dogs ate dry dog food and frozen fish. The wind outside blew constantly like that. From time to time, I could feel the whole house shaking. The first few hours of the blizzard were truly terrifying. But later, we gradually got used to the noise and shaking. Becca fell asleep next to the stove. But I still looked worried. I couldn't help but think about how Erica looked after being poisoned. I worry about whether I or Becca might show those symptoms one day. And sometimes, I would examine the knife I took from Kadar's house. By the light of the heater, I could make it out. The blade of this knife is made of black meteorite. It's the same as the one we found in the cave, but its hilt is made from a narwhal tusk. It's quite unique. On the hilt, there are intricate carvings of various Inuit symbols, but they all point to the same legend. I examined this black knife again and again. Like this, I fell asleep too. I dreamt of my childhood in the Anchorage Mountain View community. I dreamt of the Inuit fairy tales my grandmother told me. I dreamt of the meals my mother cooked. Of course, I also dreamt of my drunk father. Raging uncontrollably, he kept saying he was going to find his son named Inuri, until I was startled awake by the howling of an Eskimo dog. I leaped out of my sleeping bag. Becca was already up. She was calming the dogs down. I asked Becca what was going on. I don't know. Something must have scared them. After she answered me, she reached for the radio to contact Lahan and the others. Drilling team, this is Becca and no. Come over. No response. She switched to a private channel, asking Lahan if he's there. Still no response. Becca, though visibly anxious, still pretended to be calm and said, let's try again later. It must be the blizzard that cut off the signal. However, our snow dogs are becoming increasingly restless. Their howls have changed from the fearful whimpering to anxious growls. It seems like they're all barking frantically towards some direction outside the house, as if they're all barking in unison. I squint my eyes and look towards that direction through the crack in the door. In the thick blizzard, which almost obscures all visibility, I can vaguely see a shadow moving closer towards us. The shape of it is unfamiliar yet strangely familiar. It seems to symbolize something, but its limbs are disproportionate. From time to time, I can see antlers on that shadow, feather scales, and various shapes. I immediately called my partner over and said, Big Cuh, hurry over here and take a look at what this is. Becca did not respond behind me. My gaze never left the crack in the door. I kept calling out to her, Becca, hurry up and come look. Just then, I heard Becca behind me let out a blood-curdling scream. I immediately turned my head. Becca was just standing there, staring at the ceiling. Directly above us, there was a long-limbed creature, crawling along the wall. Its whole body kept changing, constantly twisting and shifting. You could see all sorts of different animals in its form. Yanked Becca, who was frozen in place, and pulled her next to me and the snow dog. That strange thing suddenly fell right in front of us. It crashed to the ground, turning into a mass of fleshy goo. Then from within it, a face we knew all too well emerged. Was Old Hand's face. Even more absurdly, Old Hand's face started to move. It even started to speak. He said, He didn't finish his sentence. It turned into Alika's screaming voice again. Becca, I didn't dare to move. We just heard Old Hand's face constantly changing voices. Voices. It was the various cries for help from my other teammates. All sorts of cries for help. Finally, he reverted to Lahan's voice. His voice hoarse, he uttered his last words. He fell silent. He stopped making any sounds. He looked at Becca and me, trapped with nowhere to run. He cocked his head and smiled. The thing stopped mocking Becca and me, but it still kept the appearance of Old Hand. It started circling around the two of us, like a wild animal waiting for the right moment to strike its prey. In that moment, we truly felt like two helpless prey. Becca, trembling, asked, It can imitate the voices of everyone in the team. How is that possible? What exactly is it? No. I was speechless and couldn't respond. I couldn't believe that the creature mentioned by Grandma and Elder Kadak actually existed in reality. As expected, the thing in front of us is Ijarak. Ijarak suddenly started to act strangely. Its form began to change again. Our Eskimo dog was the first to react. It charged in front of me and Becca. The creature was also shifting into various animal shapes. Then it suddenly let out a wolf's howl. Gradually it transformed into the form of an Arctic wolf, standing about 2 meters tall. At this moment, Becca also walked into the middle of our sled dogs. She made a gesture behind her with her fingers. I understood her immediately. He wanted to temporarily distract Ijalak with the snow machine, while I secretly retrieved our weapons. My eyes never left Ila for even a second, watching his constantly shifting form, but his body slowly moved towards our luggage. Slowly, I reached my left hand into my backpack until I touched the gun. Yelled at Snow Dog and Becca. The moment they dodged, I pulled out my Sako 85 rifle from my bag, quickly loaded and aimed. Yijalake realized something was wrong. He lunged at me desperately. I didn't even bother to check my aim. I just pulled the trigger. It was precisely because it was so close to me. No matter where I shot, I would hit it. The rifle bullet, in a deafening roar, tore a large chunk of flesh from that, a large piece of meat. It also rigidly collapsed to one side. Even after falling to the ground, it was still twitching and contorting, and that separated piece of flesh was also constantly changing shape. I recovered from the ringing in my ears and dizziness caused by the gunfire, and saw a lake covered in a viscous black liquid, and emanating that full stench from the drilling site, trying to get up again. Meanwhile, Bika had already removed the seals from the main gate. He violently chopped everything down. He shouted. Then he grabbed me and the snow dog and tried to run outside. For safety's sake, I raised my rifle again. I pulled the trigger, aiming at the coal stove beside Ijilak. There was a loud bang. The coal stove exploded and sparks flew in all directions. Becca shouted at me again. I also put on my backpack and charged into the unrelenting blizzard. Behind me, the firelight kept growing brighter, and I could hear Ijirak's roaring cries. We climbed onto the snowmobile, the Eskimo dog, straining to pull us as we raced through the white expanse. Slowly, we moved away from this cursed village. After identifying the general direction, we urged the snowmobiles forward, toward the ore outpost. Returning to the outpost was certainly important, but staying away from that strange thing in Ijlark was more important. After traveling for several hours in the freezing cold, both the snowmobiles and we gradually succumbed to the cold and the blizzard. But at this time, we reached an almost treeless tundra. Here, finding shelter from the blizzard wasn't easy. It wasn't simple. Luckily, because the snowfield had a wide open view, we quickly spotted a snow-covered hill. We decided to go there, build a temporary snow shelter, shovel snow and pack it down, create a wind barrier and roof facing the upwind direction. Becca and I followed the polar survival methods we were taught during training. Little by little, we built a small but safe space. We took shelter. We had been exposed to the blizzard for a long time. Becca was so cold that her teeth were trembling as she spoke. Fire, we need to start a fire quickly. I don't have the strength to talk anymore. I nodded and fumbled for the waterproof matches in my backpack. I finally managed to light the wood I had gathered. Finally, a small fire sparked between Becca and me. In this moment of danger, this fire brings not only physical warmth, but more importantly, spiritual comfort. From our temporary snow shelter, looking back at the road, the village that was just engulfed in flames after the recent struggle has now become a tiny orange dot in the distance. We are already very far from it. But thinking about Ijilak still makes me feel uneasy. Becca must have noticed that I'm still mentally tense. She started talking about some light topics. She said, "You know what? Actually, I can use a gun too. I used to learn hunting." I pulled my head back from the snow house and asked her, "Hunting? Hunt what?" she said. "When I was little, in Newfoundland, my dad used to take me and my brother to the northern peninsula, hunting some wild rabbits, grouse, and the like. Occasionally, we'd hunt moose." I moved a little closer to Becca. I said, "When you were hunting, I was probably playing baseball, back in high school." Rilika laughed in surprise. "You must have been the MVP Ho, the kind who won awards left and right. If there were an award for most time spent on the bench, I'd definitely win it hands down, because I spend most of my time sitting on the chair, waiting for my turn." We gathered around this fire, chatting casually about light topics. Eventually, we all grew tired and couldn't speak anymore. Listening to the crackling of the firewood and the howling blizzard outside the snow slowly my eyes. The firewood inside the snow hut kept burning. But at dawn, some strange sounds woke us up. Amid the howling of the wind and snow, there was an occasional cawing of crows. I woke Becca, who was huddled in my arms for warmth. We peeked out of the snow hut, the flat plain outside. I don't know when two more crows appeared. They were flying low around our shelter. What happened next made us both even more stunned. One of the crows suddenly landed above our snow house. It opened its beak, but this time, it wasn't a crow sound that came out. It was a little girl's voice. Another crow flapped its wings, continuing to circle low to the ground, but emitted the voice of a mature woman, saying, "A beauty. This name, it's as if it pulled all my memories back." In the village that was burned down, there was a mother and daughter. The mother's name was Naruk. My daughter's name is a Beauty. Could it be that these two crows? I hadn't thought it through yet. Becca tugged at the corner of my shirt and made me look at the sky.
I saw
410 dozens of crows flying low. They circled around our snow house. Each crow was making human sounds. Becca shrank back into the snow hut, frightened. She asked if those sounds were the voices of the villagers from before. Right? I didn't speak, just slowly reached my hand towards the backpack, ready to draw my gun or flee again at any moment. The crows flew lower and lower. They stopped in front of the roof of our house. More and more of them, even more nervous, squeezed my arm and asked, "What's going on? Are those crows also a Jirak? And what happened to those villagers?" Although my heart rate was terrifyingly high, I still tried my best to calm my mind and compose myself in mythology. The Jirak aren't a species that has always existed, but rather they are transformed people. Those who disrespect the laws of nature will be punished and transformed into Jirak, for example, by overhunting animals, insulting the dead, or recklessly drilling into the forbidden snow mountain. Bika stared at me and asked, her eyes filled with fear. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded and said yes. If the legend is true, we might have unintentionally released something of force. I don't know how to explain it either, those leaked gases. Maybe it's not just gas. It could be a much older kind of being. This being is turning everyone who comes into contact with it, one by one, into Jirak. Becca seemed even more scared after hearing that. So those crows are the villagers. That stitched creature in the village is not imitating the drill team members. Could it be that it is? I reaffirmed her guess. I answered her that it is the drill team members. At this point, it seems to be one of our teammates who has been taken over by that entity. It morphed into a constantly changing shape. Becca was completely stunned and asked the last question. We also turn into Jirak? Before I could answer, a crow suddenly flew down and landed directly in front of us. It opened its mouth and uttered a voice of an old man. Yes, he won't be long now. I must have adjusted the intercom system in the snow house countless times. 2 days later, we finally received the communication signal from the outpost. Aurora Outpost, this is no Karuk. Please respond if you hear me. The walkie-talkie was silent for 3 seconds. Finally, Dr. Anderson's voice came through. This is Anderson. We've been trying to reach you. You and Beck? Are you all right? I said sarcastically. For now, we're alive. Now, in the temporary shelter on the tundra. The blizzard is too strong. I don't even know exactly where we are right now. After confirming the walkie-talkie signal was stable, I told Dr. Anderson about what happened over the past few days. You could tell. By the end, she was completely confused. It took a while before she spoke. I don't know what to say anymore. The base is also affected by the gas, and it's getting worse. We're preparing for evacuation. Her answer gave me a shock. What about the Inuit village to the south of the base? Do they know they need to evacuate? We are trying to inform as many villages and towns as possible. The helicopter is expected to arrive at 6 a.m. tomorrow. We will leave Aurora in groups, so you two should hurry back. A Becca signal. She nodded in agreement. Then I responded to Anderson saying, okay. The storm is almost over. We're heading back soon. And remember, it's definitely not just toxic gas. There was a brief pause on the radio. Then Dr. Anderson's firm reply came through. We know, thank you both. Stay safe. Hurry back. The blizzard indeed stopped 2 hours later. We also began the final stretch back to Aurora, the return to the outpost. Along the way, our sled dogs started acting increasingly strange. They would occasionally stop, barking wildly at the air. Their eyes also became more and more vacant. The situation makes me extremely uneasy. One thought is becoming more and more certain in my mind. That entity will not only affect humanity. And so, with worry in our hearts, we hurried back to the outpost. When we were close to the base, we sensed an eerily unnatural silence. The entire outpost seemed like a ghost town. There was no sign of life as before. The only thing moving is the thick smoke slowly rising from the storage area. As we approached the source of the smoke at the outpost, I saw the thing I feared the most: the snowmobiles and snow machines. which were once neatly parked in the warehouse, were now burned black. Completely destroyed. Becca was holding her gun at that moment. Gripping the gun, she approached the warehouse to observe. She was muttering to herself, "Something seems wrong, no." India replied. I also tightened my grip on the Kadax Meteorite Black Blade, still on my person. Kadax Meteorite Black Blade. We both entered the main building with utmost caution. I picked up the high-powered flashlight that could still be used from the warehouse and slowly shone it down the hallway. What appeared in front of me next were our colleagues from the base. However, their fate was almost no different from that of the drilling team. Dozens of people had merged into a half-human, half-beast abomination, constantly changing their appearance and growling in various voices they once had. Seeing this scene, I just felt a wave of nausea in my stomach, almost threw up. Becca quickly covered her mouth and started to retreat. The next second, we instinctively ran in the opposite direction. We ran like crazy without making a sound, until we passed the radio room. Becca quickly called out to me. In the past few days of desperate escape, the two of us had gradually developed a tacit understanding, so I tightened my grip on the knife and walked into the room. It was just as messy and destroyed as before. Damaged wires were scattered all over the floor. All the electronic devices had been smashed into pieces. Occasionally, I could still hear a sound of something swallowing or gulping. We shined the flashlight around for a while. Only then did we discover the source of the sound. Dr. Anderson. She collapsed on the radio console. Her skin had turned an unnatural color. Most of her body was swollen. Her clothes were soaked. It was as if she'd just been pulled from the water. She was completely paralyzed, only her throat was still trembling. She trembled, making a choke sound. Get closer and listen carefully. She was still clutching the microphone tightly, saying, "Be careful, both of you come back quickly." Becca slowly approached Dr. Anderson. She gently removed the microphone from her hand. With a face full of sadness and anger, she muttered, "She was in trouble a long time ago. She was luring us back with a radio transmission at the time. There's no helicopter here, no rescue team. Nothing." "You're right, so we can't get discouraged. Instead, we need to leave the outpost quickly." I gave Becca some encouragement. She slowly began to pull herself out of despair and started preparing with me to leave this place for good. We scoured the safe areas of the base, taking medical supplies from the infirmary, finding the remaining canned food and water in the mess hall, and from the equipment room, we found the last of the polar survival gear, thermal blankets and flares, camping stoves, mountaineering gear, and things like that. It's time to evacuate Aurora Outpost. As we wound our way through the base's labyrinthine corridors, I asked a question I'd been holding back for a long time, a question I hadn't dared to ask. "Becca, why haven't we changed yet? We've been here longer than many others. Clearly we've been exposed longer than many others. They must have been exposed to that gas much earlier." Becca walked in silence for a while before speaking. "Maybe. The gas doesn't affect people according to the order of contact. It affects them according to how long they've stayed at the base." I was shocked when I heard this speculation. I quickly asked her what she meant. She then told me, "Erika is the most senior employee at the base. That might be why she was the first to be affected. You're the newest employee, having arrived last week. So it's no surprise. You should be the last to be affected." "I understand." I hesitated for a moment, then I asked a more brutal question. "What about you, Becca?" "Me, I've actually been in Aurora for a few months. Several months already. Several months. I'm shocked. Because I always thought she was a newcomer, just like me." She nodded and replied, "Yes. I'm not a newbie. It's just that I've been busy helping Lao Han and the others, so I rarely interact with everyone outside of the lab. Everyone thinks I'm new here. But actually, I'm not." She didn't continue speaking. She just looked at me pitifully. I looked at her too. I sighed. I reached out and patted her on the shoulder, saying, "It doesn't matter who runs into trouble first or later, as long as we work together to escape, right?" She smiled wryly and thanked me, saying, "Thank you. No, we'll escape together." We didn't say anything more. We walked out of Aurora and back into the snow. The snow dog that had been with us all along, helping us escape. You could say they're our two most loyal companions, and they are also our transportation off this frozen land. However, today they've begun to show strange, unusual changes. Their bodies are swollen, their fur is falling out. We even see weird lumps of flesh moving under their skin. Because of this, our snowmobiles are starting and stopping erratically. Becca had to repeatedly check on and care for our dogs. Each dog was whimpering in pain. But an undeniable fact was before us. If we didn't get rid of them soon, Becca and I would also suffer. One last time down the snow machine, our dogs were completely unable to move normally. Becca also knelt in the snow, heartbroken. She cried to them, pouring her heart out. No, I can't let them suffer like this any longer. I know she's hinting at me, but I still asked her again. Becca, are you sure you want to do this? She just looked at me and cried, but her expression was filled with unwavering determination. I understand what she meant, so I offered to help, but she refused. No, they're dogs I've been looking after and raising. I'll take care of them. I nodded, and to each dog that had persevered until now, I said goodbye. Don't turn your head. Then I heard 4 gunshots from behind. Each shot echoed for a long time across the ice field. When I turned back again, Becca had already taken the luggage off the snowmobile that could no longer be used. She handed me the map and said we had to travel light, take a shortcut, leave immediately. After studying the route for the whole morning, we came up with a preliminary plan, assuming that the small villages in this area have all been affected by that gas and turned into abandoned villages. Then the nearest large human settlement to us. It's 100 miles away, but that distance is far too great. So under Becca's suggestion, we might be better off taking the sea route. Before coming to Aurora, Becca worked on an offshore oil rig nearby. There are often patrol boats in that area. If we go from our current position, set sail towards the northeastern sea, it is expected to take 2 or 3 days. We will reach our destination after traveling 30 miles. Her idea is very risky, because we only have one inflatable kayak, and we don't know what impact that gas might have on the ocean and its creatures. We also don't know what might happen at sea. What kind of bad weather might we encounter? Becca could tell I was still hesitating. She reminded me again. No choice. We have to go to Reykjavik. We don't have enough supplies to go back. Taking the water road is risky, but the chances of survival are higher. I unfolded the map, staring at the small dot that represented the drilling platform, lost in thought. Finally, I gritted my teeth and said, let's go, we'll inflate the kayak right now. The 2 of us sat in the kayak, like a tiny speck in the vast ocean. Against the towering icebergs in the distance, we seemed even smaller. But our hope, everything is on this tiny speck of dust. We alternated between resting on the boat and keeping watch. The next day, our boat slowly approached a rocky shore. But a sudden rainstorm came out of nowhere, leaving us shivering uncontrollably. Even the paddles in our hands were nearly impossible to grip. When we took out the map to determine the direction, I noticed Becca's face was pale. Her lips were blue. Are you all right? I asked her. She said she was fine, but her trembling jaw betrayed her. It was obvious, we need to warm up quickly. We can't keep paddling on the sea. I started to slowly steer the boat toward the rocky shore. Said we must land now to start a fire and warm up. She didn't insist on continuing into the open sea, because she had already lost the willpower due to the cold. We worked together to bring the kayak onto the rocky shore. We found a cave on a small hilltop. We lit the camp stove and quickly started a fire. The cave wasn't large, but it's sheltered from the wind, and the entrance is wide enough that snow doesn't easily accumulate. This is the perfect place to rest. Next, I helped Becca, who was still shivering, take off her soaked gloves and boots. I found that her toes and fingers had turned completely black and blue, and they were stiff. It was already completely frostbitten. Then I quickly cleaned and bandaged her hands and feet. While I was doing this, I reassured her, telling her not to worry. It's not very serious. She'll be fine soon. As I was saying this, she seemed to gradually lose consciousness, probably due to the low body temperature. She started asking me deliriously, "No. Can you sing me a song?" I was startled. Singing, I'm the worst at singing. She looked at me with a glazed expression and said, "Right, don't you know any Inuit songs?" Looking at Becca, who had collapsed in my arms, I really couldn't refuse. I had no choice but to start thinking about what I should sing. When I was a child, I always refused to sleep. My grandmother would sing me a song, an ancient Inuit lullaby. It was about the eternal love between the moon and the sea. I cleared my throat and said, "Really can't sing, but I can recite the lyrics. You might as well make do with it." Like reciting a poem, I spoke the lyrics. Occasionally, I hummed a bit of the melody I remembered. The sound echoed through the cave. The moon shone brightly, and the moon gazed deeply. Softly recited. Beck also relaxed gently. She closed her eyes. Her breathing became increasingly steady. She drifted into a dream. That night felt long and exhausting. I did my best to stay awake, closely monitoring Becca's condition. I feared that if I let my guard down, I would lose my last and only partner. But I still couldn't hold on and fell asleep. I woke up in the gray morning. My body had stiffened from the cold. The fire had gone out. Becca was gone too. Becca. I quickly drew my gun and flashlight, looking around. All I could hear was the echo inside the cave. No one answered me. I stumbled to my feet and ran out of the cave. I found a trail of bare footprints in the snow. Each footprint was stained with several drops of dark red liquid. Becca's clothes were scattered along the footprints in the snow, but they were all torn to shreds. I followed her footprints. Lou picked up her clothes. I can't even describe how panicked I was. I learned this during my training. Due to hypothermia, a person can easily enter a state of confusion and disorientation and experience an intense feeling of heat. But this feeling of heat is a hallucination. By the time they realize they're in the cold, he was already close to death. I followed the footprints along the coastline for hours. Finally, I saw Becca on the snowfield. Her naked skin had a bluish-white cast. Her hair was disheveled and she was crawling. "Becca," I shouted, rushing towards her. She didn't answer me. Neither did I turn back. Swaying unsteadily, she continued to crawl on the snow. When I got closer, I actually heard her speaking something in fluent Inuit. You have to know, just a few days ago, she couldn't even say a single word in Inuit. I only heard her muttering, "The moon shines brightly. The moon gazes deeply. Wait. Isn't this the lyric I hummed for her last night? Could she be using this to try to stay awake as much as possible?" It turns out I was too naive. She suddenly switched to a different tone and muttered to herself, "Ijirak, you came tonight and brought fear to our homeland." I summoned my courage and walked over. I gently turned her to face me. But the sight before me was far worse than I had imagined. Becca, the girl who had been through thick and thin with me, now looked like a frozen corpse, yet was being pulled along by some unknown force. Her eyes were dull and lifeless. On her body, the ancient mummy tattoos we saw at the excavation site have slowly started to emerge. At this moment, she is still holding the scalpel she took from the medical kit. The moment she raised her hand, I thought it was about to be torn open without any warning. But she sliced off her own hand with one strike. "Stop, Becca," I screamed in despair, but it was in vain. I watched as her severed hand fell into the snow, but not a single drop of blood came out. Instead, it began to twist, wriggle, and change into different shapes, and her mouth was still murmuring those ancient Inuit songs. "You are hidden in the snowy mountains. We can only gaze from afar." Suddenly, her completely frozen neck twisted. Her face, as thin as a skeleton, looked at me and said, "You're the only one left. Join us." Becca began to move in front of me like a puppet. Her limbs were extremely stiff and unnaturally twisted. Even the severed hand that had fallen in the snow was slowly crawling towards me. I did not step back. Instead, I shouted at her, "Becca, don't you remember? Now you need to rely on yourself to clear your mind." The words had just left my mouth when, for a brief second or two, she and her severed hand stopped moving. But that was only for a brief second or two. Then she returned to her ferocious state. Raising the scalpel still clutched in her hand to strike at me, I instinctively pulled back, but I realized something seemed to have grabbed my left foot. My whole body was violently thrown to the ground. When I scrambled to get up, I finally noticed it was her severed hand. That hand, as if it had a mind of its own, was wriggling and crawling wildly. making trouble on the ground. Wait until I stand up again. Becca was already almost right in front of me as her hand swung the knife. She didn't forget to scream and enacted it. They re-hear. No, can't you hear them? They're singing, calling me over. Singing the song of rebirth and transformation. Thanks to my heavy winter coat, I wasn't injured by her knife, but also thanks to her monstrous strength and that severed hand. I was gripped tightly and couldn't break free. But at this very moment, what I felt more than anything was sorrow. How could the person before me be the same Becca who was once so smart and brave and shared life and death with me? Becca doesn't speak ineptitude. Becca doesn't have that strange strength. My mind kept telling me during the fight that everything in front of me wasn't real. It was as if I realized I was actually at home in Anchorage, slowly waking up from my bed. Everything that just happened, it was all just a dream I experienced. Suddenly my door burst open. Grandma was lying on the floor, frantically backing away, and in front of her was my alcoholic father. He was holding a splitting axe. Pointing at my grandmother, he said, "Get out of here. I'm taking my son back." I was startled and quickly hid myself under the covers. I dare not look at that man, my mother's ex-husband, who every time he drinks too much, comes to our house to cause trouble. When I lift the covers again, the surroundings seem to change again, transforming into a scene I can't forget, a childhood trauma. I'm holding my grandmother, her arms bleeding profusely. My mother was crying beside me, while playing with the bloody axe in her hand and continuing to drink heavily. I never wanted to remember this scene, and I was too afraid to. But when I became part of that scene again, I couldn't suppress my anger anymore. I drew the spring knife from my pocket and lunged at my father. I used all my strength to wrestle with him. My mother, standing nearby, cried loudly while trying to stop us. My father slowly stopped moving in my arms. He stopped struggling. The spring knife remained stuck in his chest like that. My father slowly uttered my name. But that voice, why was it a woman's voice? No. For a moment, my surroundings spun again, and I finally saw clearly that it was Becca collapsed in my arms. Stuck in her body was the Inuit meteorite black knife I'd been hiding in my coat. The swirling patterns on Becca's body began to fade. Her eyes gradually returned to their normal color. But it seemed like life was coming to an end. I'm sorry. I was panicked. I watched Becca's wound, the one I'd stabbed her with. Blood flowed freely, but I didn't know what to do. She spoke again. I took off my coat, already torn by the scalpel, and wrapped it around her. She said it was okay. We'll be rescued soon. It's okay, Kay. But I received no reply. Only the ceaseless howling wind answered me. I lowered my head. I discovered that Becca in my arms had stopped breathing. I don't remember how long I held Becca's stiff body. Finally, I was willing to stand up and made an important decision in my heart to give Becca a resting place. In the harsh Arctic wilderness, it's impossible to dig a grave in the permanent permafrost. It's also nearly impossible to find flowers or make a wooden coffin, so I began to search for stones around me to surround Becca's body. I built a simple inukshuk, a traditional Inuit grave. It's called an inuksuk. I recited a phrase and enacted it. Your spirit will live forever in my memory. I will never forget you. Once everything is settled, it was already nighttime. I silently walked back to the resting cave. Only one thought remains in my mind. Survive? Bika would surely want me to survive too. I don't know how many hours or days I've been walking. I'm moving across this barren wasteland. I can barely feel any change in time or space. Everywhere is desolate and cold. Later, I've even gotten used to the occasional storms and snowfall. Holding on to the hope of survival, I continued walking towards Utqiagvik. So a shadow, not too big, not too small, flashed across the snow. It seemed to pull me back from my daze to reality. I squinted and looked up at the sky, hardly believing what I saw. It was the silhouette of a helicopter. It was very far away, so far that the whirring of its rotating blades was drowned out by the wind. these past few days fleeing from the pursuit of the Iraqis. I seemed to have forgotten that modern civilization even existed. Seeing that helicopter, my heart pounded. My hands trembled as I took out a signal flare. I fired a flare into the sky. The signal flare exploded suddenly, a serpentine flash of light. It was quickly swallowed by the dark, wind-swept sky. It's hard not to wonder if that helicopter could even see my faint signal. I looked at the sky, desperate and exhausted. Even breathing was becoming difficult for me now. Finally, I saw the shadow in the high altitude. It was slowly getting bigger, bearing down on me. They saw me. At that moment, all my tense nerves relaxed. My consciousness became blurry. I vaguely heard the noise of helicopter rotors, human shouts. I fell to the ground. When I regained consciousness, the howling wind was gone. Instead, there was the rhythmic whirring of machinery. I opened my eyelids one after the other. I found myself in a hospital, wearing a thin patient gown, lying on a bed surrounded by white sterile walls. This was the first time I regained consciousness after the ordeal. Soon I would fall asleep again. For the next few days, I was like that, sometimes awake, sometimes not. Each time I struggled to open my eyes, I could see different people surrounding me. Nurses, doctors, and some people in full gear like soldiers. Finally, my strength and consciousness gradually returned to normal, began to sit up, and anxiously ask the people visiting me, the doctors. I wanted an answer, but their responses left me breathless. They told me it was the Aurora Research Station drilling team who accidentally released toxic hydrogen sulfide into the atmosphere. The toxic gases damaged the nerves of all of us, causing us to become agitated, violent, and even hallucinate. These gases covered the village and the outposts. The villagers were displaced. The outpost staff turned on each other. And I, along with an indigenous child, were the only two survivors of this disaster. There was no Ijarak. There is no talking raven. There is no Becca turning into a monster. Those are just hallucinations caused by my nerve damage. They're just hallucinations. Just hallucinations. Right? Do you know? I really want to believe them. I really want to believe it, but I can't trust it. If toxic gas has caused the villagers to be displaced, then why hasn't a single villager been found? The rescue team has been searching relentlessly for days. Yet not a single one of the 100 villagers has been seen, even if they froze to death while wandering. Where are the bodies? Furthermore, the search and rescue team found the Inuksuk I'd left for Becca, but the grave was empty. Was completely empty. They only found a trail of bare footprints leading from the grave towards the sea. They told me that after investigation, the footprints, it can be judged that it's 4 days after the poisonous gas dissipated. How? A deceased woman encased in stone just stood up and went swimming in the sea. I don't believe it. I really don't believe it. Such a major accident occurred around the Aurora outpost. The US authorities declared the entire region a disaster area, claiming that the residual toxins in the local air were too high and no longer suitable for human habitation. Because I myself also have Inuit ancestry. I've been tirelessly dedicating myself to the relocation efforts of our fellow countrymen. In the process, I also found the drive for academic research. I pursued a fight in anthropology. My thesis focused on the resilience of Inuit society in the face of climate and cultural destruction. In fact, immersing myself in research was also my way of escaping the psychological scars left by the Arctic. Those days in the Arctic in 2021, it left me with an indelible psychological scar. After graduation, I moved back to my hometown in Anchorage. I took up a job as a university lecturer. I tried to live as normally as possible. During my years in research, I also spent quite a bit of spare time investigating strange incidents around the world that were officially labeled as accidents. Incidents that were hidden under the guise of official explanations. I heard there's a strange creature in Siberia called the Mimicker. Could this be another name for the Ijalak? I also learned that a similar behemoth, oozing black liquid, like various animals fused together, once appeared in a Christmas tree plantation cavern in Canada. Could it also be related to the Ijalak? I now really enjoy walking alone by the coast. I walk while reflecting on these questions. Every time I look at the polar moon and the sea, I truly wish that these so-called ghosts and monsters really existed. The reason is simple. I just hope that one day by the sea, I might see something on the sea or the shore. A figure of a deceased person appears. Beck, I miss you so much.